Coogs house. Conner Weigman has not set foot on the field for Houston in a real game yet, and people are already talking about him in next year's NFL draft. And it's interesting to see what they think.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Coogs, the daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to stop by, thank you for making Locked On Coogs your first listen of the day. We should make your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Coogs, like the everydayer that you are. If you want to join the conversation, but you don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below. When playing blackjack, do you hit on 16? There's been a little bit of a debate around the lunch table today. Not that I encourage gambling at lunch tables, but I will say it's quite the debate to have. Look, today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, and we'll get into that fun in a second because they got some cool stuff going on over at FanDuel for the NBA playoffs. But Conner Weigman already being projected as an NFL draft pick in 2026. We got to talk about that for a little bit. I do want to talk about what Brett Yormark said about the college football playoff and more about scheduling and so on. I also want to start to figure out what's happening with the Houston Cougar men's basketball schedule as they're kind of piecemealing what that non-conference is going to look like. But okay, Conner Weigman, listen. Conner Weigman was a 5-star, one of the highest rated prospects at high school of all time. Ends up at A&M. Things don't quite work out. He gets redshirted. He gets hurt. He gets hurt again and plays hurt. And it ultimately leads to a pretty bad year while he's playing hurt, right? And he comes home to the University of Houston, the city of Houston, last December in a way that really shocked, I believe it was December, might have been November, shocked a lot of people, sent shockwaves through, oh, this is Willie Fritz's moment in a lot of ways, right? That doesn't mean to say there weren't critics and naysayers saying well, that's not a big enough deal, or that's not going to do that. There are plenty of those. It's sports. Those are those all the time, right? But Weigman shows up to Houston in December, and he enrolls in the spring, obviously, goes to spring practice, has the spring game scrimmage of sorts, looks good, right? And all of that. People are already talking about next year's NFL draft because you got to write something if you're a draft analyst. Obviously, it's way too early kind of predictions. And Pro Football Focus, who if you've listened to the show before, know I have a lot of respect for the way they do analytics because they do it pretty much unlike anyone. It's like them and Spectrum Stats and basketball. Anyway, they have Conner Weigman as the 10th quarterback taken in the 2026 draft. That is interesting for a number of reasons. One, we have not seen him bluntly play very well. He played hurt in his time at A&M. It wasn't really the best version of himself. We only briefly saw him play not hurt. It was like a drive. It looked okay, right? And I think that it's interesting to say that projection is as high as it is in some ways. And honestly, as the guy that was ranked as high as he was in high school, maybe it's not so crazy that's as high as it is, right? That makes total sense. For what it's worth, and looking at their projections, he is one of 2 Big 12 quarterbacks. They have their top 10, Sam Leavitt from Arizona State. They have at 4th. Conner Weigman's also one of 5 different transfers they have in their top 10 for next year's NFL draft, or top 10 quarterbacks, I should say, for next year's NFL draft. Sam Leavitt being one of them, having transferred many moons ago. But Nico Yamaleva, Carson Beck, John Mateer, and Conner Weigman make 5 of them that have transferred in the last couple of years before the NFL draft. I think it's really interesting that in the write-up for Conner Weigman, it mentions that a year ago, they had him as the number 1 quarterback taken in this past year's NFL draft. This is obviously before Cam Ward became Cam Ward and all of those kinds of things. But I think it's interesting to say, that shows some pretty clear SEC bias because, spoiler, the number 1 on the PFF list this year is also an SEC quarterback. But 2, it does in the write-up a pretty decent job of talking about just some poor play of Conner Weigman at Texas A&M but doesn't mention the injury history at all. We know from the reporting in January and February that they were very serious injuries and like turning down surgeries at the time, level of like, do I want to play right now or not kind of decision making. And the low passing grade that PFF gave him basically is what pulled him from first a year ago to 10th now. And that is pretty damning. I'm not going to lie to you, right? But that they don't mention the injury is interesting because it's very well documented. It's out there. Multiple sources have written on it. Go find it, right? I think what's interesting in looking at their mechanics breakdown is some of what they had to say about him, the physical side of his play a year ago felt very injury based. The deep ball precision and those kinds of things like that all very much plays into having a hurt shoulder, right? Of course, that wasn't up to snuff. He was hurt, right? And I don't mean to like percentage wise hurt guys very often. If you're out there and playing, you're either 100%, you're not 100%, or you're not playing. There's not a whole lot in between for me, but he was somewhere in the middle category, right? The question I think is interesting that they pose is about decision making. And I don't mean to say that there's no way injury impacted that at all, right? Injury absolutely would have impacted his decision making a year ago because he's trying to figure out what he can and can't do on a literal snap to snap basis, right? Based on how he got hit the play before or whatever, right? And so I think that without knowing how that weighed in, it'll be interesting to see how he develops with quarterback coach Sean Bell, offensive coordinator Slade Nagel, how he develops at Houston as a decision maker and how he looks at a decision maker healthy. It's crazy. A lot of quarterbacks get to be a lot better decision makers when they're healthy because they can make throws. It's a crazy concept. Now, I think the other interesting piece about this list, besides Conner Weigman being on it as Houston Cougar, which is nice to see Houston represented, to say the least, is that the Big 12 is notably being biasedly ignored. There's a better way to say that, but Big 12 being ignored is crazy to me. Sam Levitt being 4th, Conner Weigman being 10th. Obviously, you don't mention Jake Retzloff, given the situation surrounding him and BYU. Totally get that. If you don't know what's going on there, go check out Jake Hatch and Locked On BYU Cougars, doing a great job of covering that story. Retzloff maybe not college football. We'll see. And if he's, the alleged things or he's guilty of, he should be and should be a lot more than that, right? Anyway, it's alleged, so we'll see. Sawyer Robertson, not mentioned. Crazy to me that he's not mentioned in this list. Avery Johnson, Kansas State, not mentioned. Bananas, bonkers. We've seen the NFL adopt the running quarterback. Why isn't Avery Johnson mentioned at all? Look, I'm not high on Behren Morton as a quarterback, but given the surrounding people that Texas Tech has put there around Behren Morton, he's going to have a good statistical year, and it would make sense that he's drafted high because of that next year. Kind of crazy to me. Even like Caden Salter at Liberty, now Colorado. We just saw Shedeur Sanders at Colorado turn himself into a guy that got to go, get Heisman votes and all that. He didn't win the Heisman, obviously, but he was invited to New York. I don't get how guys like look, there are quarterbacks out there. I don't mean to badmouth too much, but guys that just like look the part, 6'4", 220, whatever, right? Those guys seem to make this list more so than guys with actual production. I think that's interesting to see because PFF is very numerical based, right? They're very analytical, and it does tend to skew the data, and that their list still has such an SEC bias is an interesting thing to follow. Now, Houston's in it. We should be happy. We are good. I also think it's interesting that Conner Weigman has 2 years of eligibility. They clearly think he fell a lot of spots, and they're still projecting him in next year's NFL draft as opposed to the one after that. I don't quite have an answer for that as to why they think that. I do think, though, it probably has something to do with the fact that Houston's got really good young quarterbacks on campus and coming to campus, right? Austin Carlisle looked great in the spring game, an electric runner, true dual threat quarterback. A lot of people has one of the top players in the city of Houston a year ago, right? What is he going to look like? He may redshirt this year to not waste any eligibility. He may get his own package. Who knows what happens there, right? Obviously, young Chris and his legs will offer some flexibility in offense too. And then Houston does have committed the number 1 player in the state of Texas in Keyshawn Henderson, number 1 quarterback in a lot of people's rankings. Certainly our Brian Smith, our Locked On, the portal show that does all recruiting things. He has him as the number 1 quarterback in America. Keyshawn Henderson's class 2026, you got to think that he's coming in to put some pressure on this too. So Is PFF saying Conner Weigman is going to go be 10th in next year's draft because he might not be able to sit around and wait? he might not have that spot. We'll see. But it's interesting digestion. Always good to see Houston on lists of things. Next, speaking of lists of things, so lists of reasons, transition, that Brett Yormark has the Big 12 favoring one type of college football playoff versus another. I want to get to that, why they changed the basketball schedule, and more in just a second. But first, today's show, as we mentioned, is brought to you by everybody's over at FanDuel, because the NBA playoffs, heading to the NBA Finals, Oklahoma City is now in it, full swing. Crazy drama every night. That Indiana and New York series, it feels like every single game comes down to the final seconds. True, just cannot scripted level drama. FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action, stay in the game before tip-off, live, player props, performance trends, same-game parlays, all kinds of fun stuff there. $200 back in bonus bets if your first $5 bet hits. Even if the Rockets aren't in the playoffs, you got to admit that's a pretty fun way to go about watching these things. Now, if you got an idea of who's going to heat up, you can go to FanDuel mid-game and get in on the action. New to FanDuel, it's the best time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com, place your first $5 bet. If it hits, that's $200 back in bonus bets. Make every moment more. FanDuel, official sports partner of the NBA. Parker Andrews locked on Coogs here. And, through all of Big 12 days and conversations at the end of the spring, Brett Yormark he always says something that goes a little viral, right? That's just kind of what Brett Yormark is. It's kind of what he does, and he gets the game in that sense. I will point out that one of the guys speaking at media conversations was also Kelvin Sampson. He was speaking on behalf of conference in a lot of ways, and that was pretty cool to see. He didn't say anything quite as inflammatory. However, Brett Yormark said two things I took note of. And the first one, I think a lot of people took note of. That is that he believes, after talking to ADs and folks with his member schools, the Big 12 is in favor, or he's certainly acting like the Big 12 is in favor of the 5+11 college football playoff model. Now, there are two models being circulated out there, and it seems like it's a 50-50. People love one or hate one, right? The 5+11 model is the highest ranked 5 conference champions plus 11 at-large bids would make the 16-team college football playoff, right? The other model being tossed around is a 4-4-2-2 and 4 model. That is 4 SEC schools, 4 Big 10 schools, 2 ACC schools, 2 Big 12 schools, and 4 at-large teams. Now, there are pros and cons to each of these. People have pointed out, though, and the Big 12 side, and that's the Houston side of things, that the 4-4-2-2-2 or 4-4-2-2 and 4 model is more Big 12 teams than were in it last year, when it was 4 at-large teams or 4 conference champions and then a series of the next 8 at-large teams, right? And that is true. There's just the one Big 12 team in it a year ago. And even if extended the field out to 16 a year ago, you would not have had more than one Big 12 team in it. Last year, if you had the 5+11 model that Yormark is pushing for, you'd have had conference champions Oregon, Georgia, Boise State as a ranked high conference champion, Arizona State, and Clemson. That's your 5. The next 11 would have been Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Tennessee, Indiana, Alabama, Miami, Ole Miss, and South Carolina. And I have to say that that is fairly SEC heavy. Let's just see, it's just fairly SEC heavy, even though I don't think South Carolina was all that great last year, even though I think Ole Miss might have been a little overrated last year, even though Alabama got blown out by the same Oklahoma team Houston nearly beat at their house, right? I get that. I should point out that in the model from last year, as you extend it out to 16, the 17th seed would have been, the first one out would have been BYU. The 18th seed would have been Iowa State. So theoretically, the Big 12 would have had the first 2 out under that model. In the 4-4-2-2 and 4 model, they would have been a whole lot different. The second Big 12 school, in theory, would have been BYU, who did not play in the conference title game. Iowa State took that loss and then fell behind BYU, and BYU would have been jumping what theoretically would have been South Carolina. And I think that's an interesting way to look at this too. I'm not sure which one I'm personally in favor of. I go back and forth. That's why I say people are 50-50 on this every day. I do think, though, that ultimately my biggest concern with the 5+11 model, which a lot of people voice, I'm not alone in this, is the selection committee will continue, undoubtedly, unless regulated, to be fairly SEC and Big Ten biased, right? And that's just the way that is. They're going to look at the middle of the pack or lower third of the pack in that conference as somehow different than middle or lower third somewhere else. And that is just bluntly not the case. Houston and Oklahoma were both at the bottom tiers of the conference last year, and they played each other tooth and nail in Norman. If that game's in Houston, I'm not so far to say that Houston wins that game in Houston, right? We saw, frankly, conference champion Arizona State of the Big 12 take Texas to overtime in a bowl game, in the college football playoff game. Texas took SEC conference champion Georgia to overtime as well. So clearly, again, transfer probably doesn't always work, but they're fairly competitive, right? I think that the other piece of this is that, winning your conference should matter. Doing well in your conference should matter, right? You don't always control what the other teams around you are doing, who's good, who's bad, but winning your conference should ultimately mean something. I guess that it was interesting that when Yormark said that the conference people mostly wanted the 5+11, he also added in that most people's biggest push for the Big 12 was like getting to their caliber of play more consistently to that of other leagues, to where you're not worried about, you're more worried about how many at-large teams can you get, not how many would you miss out on, right? And honestly, while that's aspirational and great, I just don't know that it matters if the voters are going to be, and the placement committee is going to be doing the same old thing that they've been doing. Now, I do feel fairly confident that there will be a decision made by this sometime this summer. I do feel fairly confident that next year's playoff is going to be a 16-team playoff. And I know that Houston is not right now projected to be a team that's going to be competing for that. I do think Houston's going to win a lot more games next year, people realize, but that's not for this episode of the podcast. I think, though, that Houston's building and trending in the correct direction. And that's why you got to pay attention to these things now, because when you get to be where Iowa State, BYU, even Arizona State, Arizona State went from last to first last year as far as preseason to end season projections, right? I do think that Houston's got to pay attention to this, because by the time you make that jump, you got to know what the game you're getting into is. You got to know what the rules are before you play the game, right? Now, speaking of play the game, the other thing Yormark said was that the Big 12 was going to be moving officially and formally the men's basketball schedule from 20 games back to 18 games. One of the rare times you see people bluntly forego money. Games equal income, right? And that while the women's program stuck with 18 games last year, the men jumped to 20. Kelvin Sampson talked about how it was bad for the sport. He was not alone in that as far as Big 12 coaches. Houston won the Big 12 going 19-1. It was not that Houston struggled. It was that it was an incredibly taxing grind, right? Now, Houston, continued to win the Big 12 Conference Tournament and win the Final Four matchup and win 5 of the 6 games they played in March Madness, right? I get that argument. However, they also won some sneaky close ones. And that doesn't mean it wasn't extra exhaustive, right? So Yormark mentioned in talking about the moving back to 18 games, even though that gives up 2 games worth of revenue as far as each program goes, that the wear and tear and, quote, travel exhaustion all factored into the decision. And what I appreciate about that is it's the same kind of thing you hear pro sports, and that's why you get a pro sports guy like Yormark, right? Pro sports programs talk about, pro sports leagues talk about, where like in this conference in basketball, you could be playing in Orlando on Saturday, in Provo on Tuesday, somewhere in the middle of those two for a quick home game on Saturday before turning back around and playing in Tucson on Big Monday, right? That's a crazy amount of travel on top of all the game and recovery and training and getting prepared and all of that, right? And so that they're factoring that in and taking down 2 games, you hopefully gets a couple more days off throughout the season. Frankly, you also get a couple more days of practice somewhere in there. Like, things work out better that way. It also means Houston going 19-1 will be the record for most wins in the conference for the foreseeable future, because you can't win 19 games in the regular season when you only play 18 of them. And I kind of like that part too. Speaking of basketball, more news on that and the schedule. If you can read some tea leaves with me, I think we're getting an idea of what's going to happen. Let's talk about it in 1 second. Parker Ainsworth, Locked On Coogs here, talking about Houston Cougar basketball as more starts to be put together. I want to talk about what we know is going to happen, and what we can kind of figure out may happen in that. Houston will be playing 13 non-conference games. That's how it's going to work. And I think as we look at that, we know Houston has been announced to open the season with Lehigh. Lehigh has had CJ McCollum come through as won a first-round games 15 seed, had that kind of history. More often than not, they're just a good Patriot League program, but it's a good game to open the season with. You got to have that one, right? You know, as a program, Houston's going to be playing in 3 games in the NIL Players Era basketball. It's not calling itself an MTE, but the basketball being played over Thanksgiving week in Las Vegas. Great field there. Very real possibility of playing 3 Power 4 teams. Very real possibility of playing 3 Quad 1 games, frankly, in that week. You know, you're going to Birmingham to play Auburn. I believe that game is November 16th. Kind of as a reciprocity for them going to Toyota a year ago. So you know you got that one. It sounds like the other things you know you're putting together here are that you're going to have a neutral game at Fertitta Center. Sampson said that that's going to be happening, and that you're going to have some sort of a neutral site game in the Northeast. And I got thoughts on both of those. One, the neutral site at Fertitta Center is interesting because you've had a neutral site game in the state of Texas for what's now 5 years, right? Last couple seasons, you've been at Fertitta. You played Auburn there last year. You played A&M there the year before, right? Both of those were functionally parts of big multi-game, multi-team deals. Like when you played Auburn, you also had, I believe it was LSU and Rice or somebody playing right before that, right? A year ago, you played A&M. You had another pair of games. Texas was involved in that. I think because there's a lot of orange in the stands. I think maybe it was Tennessee. Anyway, and so they were playing right at the Fertitta Center, at the Toyota Center right before Houston. Then when you played the couple seasons before that, you played up in DFW and Fort Worth at Dickey's, which was nice, you know, getting ready for the American Athletic Conference tournament. But also, you saw like Houston played St. Mary's one year, which was a high-end Group of 5 school. You saw them play Oklahoma State once upon a time in Dickey's Arena too. And so you're playing a nearby Power 4 team, or St. Mary's is a good program. Auburn, it was their best year they've had potentially ever, and they kind of knew they were building that roster, right? And so you're looking to play someone good nearby, close to home, in that Fertitta Center game, in that Toyota Center game. Keep saying Fertitta, in that Toyota Center game. I would imagine that's another SEC school. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's going to be a big kind of thing there. The neutral site Northeast game has me intrigued. It was announced at roughly the same time that BYU will be playing UConn at TD Garden in Boston. Much in the same vein as I mentioned the games at Toyota, it feels like that could be the kind of deal where you tag in a second game and make it a large event happening in Boston. It also would make sense that you could have, without having a full Big 12, Big East kind of matchup, you could have Houston play St. John's or something in Boston, and that would be part of that kind of feel and vibe. Now, I don't know that you're going to do that if you potentially play St. John's in Las Vegas. You know, we'll see how that shakes out. They might be waiting to get confirmation from Vegas on who plays who before they set that, right? That makes total sense to me too. You could also see, and this would happen in, also, you could tag this into, I guess, in the Northeast game, Texas Tech is playing Duke at Madison Square Garden. When that happened back in 2019, They tagged it into two other games at Madison Square Garden that day. It was a big full-day event, right? And you could see Houston get pulled into that as well, because I think when Texas did it before, there was other Big 12 schools there. And so you end up playing someone up in the Madison Square Garden, making a New York City thing. We know that obviously Yormark loves the New York City, has talked for a long time about putting the Big 12 in New York City, especially Big 12 basketball in New York City, right? For what it's worth, he also has connections to Barclays with his times at the Nets and all that. Do you see Houston getting to play at Barclays Center? I wonder if there's some way you also see, though, Houston and Kansas playing one of those. And hear me out here. It was supposed to happen where you played Kansas in a non-conference counter game in Mexico City. That was supposed to be deemed the most fair way to do it, because it was not taking away a home game from the one's conference slate. Playing in Mexico City expanded the game. That has hit some hiccups. Hard to play international games right now. But it does feel like you could have that matchup happen in Barclays, Madison Square, TD Garden in Boston, Wells Fargo in Philly, somewhere up to put the flag up there for the Big 12, because we know that that's near and dear to Brett Yormark's heart. That'd be a way to transition as far as your long-term scheduling goes. The program's both going to have that set aside, right? And you can move that up there. Now, without knowing who those opponents are, but having some ideas, right? Are you playing another great Big East team? Are you playing another great ACC team? The way that Texas Tech is playing Duke, could you pair up with Will Wade's North Carolina State? They've really built that program very quickly. Could you see Terrence Arsenault and play NC State and Madison Square Garden? We know that they also have a lot of East Coast favor, right? Two Texas schools, two schools from North Carolina. That'd be a fun deal. It looks like we know kind of sort of something about 7 of the 13 non-conference games, and we can feel pretty confident that 6 of those are going to be potentially or probably Power 4 opponents, right? You have a pretty good feeling that most of your Vegas games will be, that Auburn obviously is, and then Fertitta and the Northeast game, I feel like both you can confidently say should be, if you're going to showcase Houston like that, right? That plus the Big 12 schedule is leading up to be one of the most difficult schedules this school has ever played. And I don't say that facetiously, and I don't say that intimidating level. From a macro level, that is extremely challenging. Even if you throw in the high-end mid-major in Vegas, or make the Toyota Center game some high-level mid-major there, as them coming to Houston or whatever, that's all fine. You could even play some Power 4 blue blood that's just down. North Carolina has not looked like North Carolina in a long time. If you saw them in Madison Square, maybe they just aren't having a great year. Who knows, right? I do think that it's very evident that the Big 12 and that college basketball as a whole wants to start showcasing Houston more, which is interesting. And that Houston, after last season, is looking to continue to grow and find more challenges. And so I would anticipate sometime in the following couple weeks to hear more about those games, and that Samsung has leaked that information. And whenever that happens, we'll be here to break it down, the potential matchups and all those kinds of things here at Locked on Coogs. Make sure you're subscribing to the bell so you know that we are live. Thank you so much for tuning in like the everydayer that you are. Locked on Coogs, primary Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every single day. Go Coogs.